Very few 90s releases can claim a spot in the all-time horror top 50, but it was a decade that knew its job. It had to consolidate the slasher takeover of the 80s while establishing horror's potential for the 21st century. In these 10 best horror films of the 90s, you'll find hidden gems, scary trailers, and fascinating hints at coming attractions. Peter Jackson's third feature ended his splatter phase with a comedic splash. Known as Braindead outside of North America, it remains one of the goriest films ever made and proved to be hugely influential on the zombie resurgence to come. Jackson's involvement in horror didn't end here, although it did win out over his higher profile Hollywood debut, The Frighteners. You can trace his early horror sensibilities to the award-winning epics he would embark on at the end of the decade. A twist on vampire stories, CRONOS was Del Toro's first feature and firmly established his gift for visually compelling fantasies on the international stage. Despite a few detours, a direct line can be drawn from Pan's Labyrinth to The Shape of Water, Del Toro's homage to classic Universal horrors that claimed Oscar glory 24 years later. Paul W. Anderson's space horror is just one of the films on this list that enjoyed growing cult status after it bombed on release. It sticks out in a director's portfolio packed with action, horror, and franchise building. Its strength lies in its combination of a solid cast, fantastic production design, and horrific realization of the hell the crew finds around a distant star. It carves out a place in the genre, which isn't an easy thing to do, even as it displaces David Fincher's flawed Alien 3 from this list. It's also a deceptively clever film that rewards repeat viewings with classic references. It's hard to believe that this came out on the 10th anniversary of the dreamy original. The Nightmare on Elm Street saga endured a decade of ups and downs, although Freddy Krueger kept his knives a bit sharper than his mask-wearing rivals over his original 6 films. With his new Nightmare, Wes Craven returned to the franchise he started with a postmodern eye. He set up a critical development of 90s horror on the way, which he would fully explore with Scream 2 years later. While plaguing his actors with meta-terrors, Craven took the opportunity to right some wrongs. He returned Krueger to his original vision with a modified look that supported his rediscovered feral and scarier personality. Director Bernard Rose relocated the story based on Clive Barker's short story, The Forbidden, from class-ridden Liverpool to racially and socially charged inner-city Chicago. The result is an enduring and haunting horror that's so much more than a supernatural slasher. Rose was helped enormously by Tony Todd's towering performance and the nursery melody of Philip Glass's score. Mwah. CANDYMAN spawned immediate sequels but has remained as underrated as it is relevant. Its legacy could be assured by the 2021 version produced by Jordan Peele, which promises to be a sequel and not a remake. How could you leave Tony Todd behind the mirror? Wes Craven's final franchise would set another significant bar for movie horror. His partnership with screenwriter Kevin Williamson proved to be definitive. Few writers influenced 90s horror like Williamson. While the subgenre owes him a great deal, Scream proved that the blade was double-sided. Depending on your perspective, the sprightly casting, slick direction, and sharp script either radically redefined or mortally wounded the slasher. Even with the untimely loss of Craven, the Scream franchise remains alive, kicking, and probably its own worst enemy. RINGU ushered in a new wave of J-horror, setting in motion a cycle of Western remakes failing to match the success of the originals. Hideo Nakata's adaptation of Koji Suzuki's novel, odd given its visual hook, mines the same concept of reportage and investigation as other films on this list. But Nakata realizes RINGU's vengeful monster with unrivaled precision. Every horror fan can picture the twitching form of Sadako creeping from the well towards the camera, or really your screen. Chilling, a superb fusion of the modern and the supernatural, and deceptively simple. In a decade of eclectic horror, Audition emerged late as potentially one of the most influential horror films of the 90s. It's not director Takashi Miike's only controversial film, but the psychodrama split audiences and critics at the time and still inspires debate. It paved the way for the torture horror subgenre that would dominate the decade that followed, and it's fair to say that 21st century horror probably wouldn't be the same without it. Complicated, subtle, and sometimes nearly unwatchable. Blair Witch might be the most famous horror movie of the 90s, firmly re-establishing the found footage subgenre for good or bad. Although it shared horror headlines with The Sixth Sense in 1999, The Witch's legacy proved way more significant. It cut through to the mainstream, tapping into social and individual trends with a fiercely guarded independence. It quickly proved to be one of the most profitable independent films of all time, and its struggle to establish a franchise was inevitable. That said, it's hard to imagine what Blumhouse would have been without it. Okay, we get it. Some people argue that Lambs is a purely psychological thriller, but that misses the essential role thrillers played in the development of horror. It deserves recognition for its genre elements and for being the only horror film to sweep the Academy Awards. Lecter is one of the great creations in the genre. While Brian Cox originated the role in Michael Mann's Manhunter 5 years before, Anthony Hopkins' reptilian otherness sweeps that clipped coldness aside before he even mentions fava beans. What are your favorite 90s horror films? Any that we missed? Let us know in the comments down below, and as always, be sure to like and subscribe for more awesome videos like this one right here on We Got This Covered.